Final Fantasy 12.
Final Fantasy 13 is the infamous one.
Final Fantasy 13.
Gets to the end and then
yeah.
it's good.
Look, I know my Final Fantasies, buddy. In film criticism terms, they talk a lot about the first 22 minutes of a movie, how at the 22-minute point something really, really big should happen, and video games don't necessarily have like the equivalent language of that.
So what's a good example of a movie you think that lays out in the first 22 minutes? Or thereabouts, that sets up all the stakes, the characters you're supposed to care about, and then gives you a sort of endpoint of like, okay, here's what all the action's moving towards.
I think pretty much any James Bond movie does a really good job of setting up like who he is, like what sort of things he's gonna get into, like within the first opening scene. Because usually like it sort of sets up the larger problem.
Yeah, the James Bond's first 5 minutes is like it's like a Looney Tunes sketch, like before a movie. It's like, here's James Bond wrapping up his previous adventure. The Raid does a very good job of getting all the dudes into the building, the situation that there's something wrong.
That's actually like a perfect video game movie if you think about it.
It is, it is. The video game thing's different because video games can be 10, 15, 20, 35 million hours, right? I mean, I know that I played the game Dragon Quest VII a long time ago, back in 2001. Within the first 5 minutes of the game, I was like, no matter how long this is, I have to play it all the way to the end, and I have to know what happens to these people. I just have to know.
Because why?
Well, because the story sets it up as you're two kids who live in a fishing village, and you're friends with the prince, and it's on this little tiny island. And you talk to townspeople at the very beginning, and they're like, it's so strange that this little tiny island is all there is in the world. And you're in the castle, and you talk to like a professor, and he's like, we dug up these old maps from the archives downstairs, but this can't be our world. And that was like the moment in that game that I was like, whoa, that's like a really good hook. And I played that game it takes like 120 hours to beat that game.
I have the opposite problem, where I almost never finish anything, and then for whatever reason, I finish the stupidest games. Star Ocean, Faith and Integrity, whatever the most recent one was.
Integrity and faithlessness?
Integrity and faithlessness. So Star Ocean's a good example where they do this thing where there's this twist halfway through where that either the world flips or you meet people from outer space, or all of a sudden it's like, okay, now you're gonna go do the sci-fi thing. There was this medieval thing for the first half, and now we're gonna go do Star Trek Redux. There's a whole version of the game you'll never see if you don't make it past 5 hours, 10 hours. And I actually think there's very few games that will show you anything within the first 2 hours. I just finished Far Cry 5. That game is the same in the first 2 hours as it is in the 40th hour.
That game actually does a really good job, sort of going back to what we originally were talking about, where like the first little mini island you start off in is pretty much the entire game.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, like you know what you're gonna get into, and if you don't know by the end of like the last sort of thing you have to do on that island that you're not gonna like this game, then you're like, all right, I pretty much played Far Cry 5. I know enough about it to talk about it.
Dragon Quest, much more linear. It's like following a long piece of string rather than like being inside of a maze, slowly looping your way out.
Final Fantasy 12 was a good example. A lot of people were like, I got bored and I gave up. I didn't like the main character. The main character's kind of an idiot. And I remember seeing this famous defense that went around about Final Fantasy 12 was just play get to like the first 10 hours, then it starts to get like really good. I beat that game. I don't know how. I played it for.
And what convinced you in the first, because you obviously got to hour 10, but.
Yeah, so I obviously got past whatever the leap was. I guess it performed really well in 3D, and when I turned the analog stick, it spun around very smoothly.
So that's a good example.
And I like
that. If a game, I hate dinging games that have stiff controls or don't handle well, or there's this, the gunplay's not great, or the camera's weird. That is something that I just don't have time for anymore. And I think it's maybe just a luxury of playing so many games, but if it doesn't, the harder it is for me to interface with the game, it's kind of like having a book and then it gets wet and the pages are all stuck together, and it's like, all right, I'm gonna move on. Maybe when it's dry or when I'm in a different frame of mind, I'll come back, but
When they patch the book, maybe I'll come back to it. Some open world games for me in particular, like, I know this is blasphemous, but like The Witcher 3, for example, I played like the first like opening moments of that game, and I played it for a while, but then I was just like, yeah, I think I'm good. Like I had that, I had that moment where I was like, yeah, I think I'm good. I'll get back to this later, I guess, when like, when I have time for it, I guess. On the other side of the spectrum, like I just started playing Bayonetta for the first time recently, and like Bayonetta 1 opens in that graveyard, and it's ridiculous. It's
It completely owns its own stupidity.
Fly Me to the Moon, like techno version, and I was like, I'm gonna beat this game 100%. Like I'm definitely gonna beat this game. But on like, there's also those games where like they just like require such a grind, like a Monster Hunter. But I feel like those games require you, like you said before, like you have to get through like 10 hours. But for Monster Hunter, it's more like 60 plus.
Monster Hunter Portable 2 had a mandatory tutorial that was literally 8 hours of going on these little kindergarten missions. The idea of Monster Hunter was so appealing to me that I suffered through this tutorial. So, maybe my brain is configured that way. I love the ideas of some games enough to not actually think mechanically about them.
So what's a game that you dropped off of and wish you hadn't? The first couple hours didn't, you took the wrong thing away from that and you realized like, oh, I actually would have loved to finish that.
I had the same sort of experience with another open world game, Horizon Zero Dawn, where like for whatever reason, that first like hour or two, I wasn't into it. I'd also played it on the heels of playing Breath of the Wild, which I adore, which I like. I love that open world experience in Breath of the Wild, and like playing Horizon right after that, where I couldn't climb a rock or I had to look for specific yellow things that were climbable. For me, that was hard to like detach right after Breath of the Wild. So I needed to I needed some time to like let that wash away and then come back to Horizon, and it was like a much better experience.
I know so many people who quit playing The Last of Us. So many people, to a point where, so it's like, I have a lot of friends who don't really play video games, right? They don't really know much about them, but some games really, really attract them and they want to play them. I don't know anybody in this circle of people who has beaten The Last of Us, and they all had the same complaint, which was, it was just boring. The first hour was really boring. And I'm like, that's nuts, because that game owns in the first hour.
Yeah, that opening scene is...
That's an example of a game I dropped off of in the first hour.
Whoa.
You did? Yeah, really,
I'm
really.
out of here, guys.
Why?
Not out of any kind of visceral like, oh, this is terrible. It was more just, I was like, okay, standard zombie setup, this is very emotional. It felt very sentimental and
The
affected.
people are the monsters.
The people, yeah, and it's like,
You didn't play enough to learn that the people are the real monsters.
And it's like The Walking Dead. For me personally, what is actually most likely to get me to walk away from a game is feeling like it's been distilled within that first hour. Like, the better the game is at telling me what it is. It's like watching a trailer for a movie and you see in a minute and a half, you're like, oh, that's the movie. Like, those are all the arcs. Those are all the rhythms. This is what the characters care about.
All the best jokes are in the trailer.
Yeah.
I feel like Zelda gives you pretty much everything in the beginning. Like
Breath of the Wild?
Breath of the Wild, excuse me.
Yeah.
Like on the Great Plateau, it tells you like, here's everything you're pretty much gonna do. And it does a good job of being like, okay, now go. And you just do that for 100 hours.
In Breath of the Wild, you get the guy telling you he's gonna give you the glider if you do such and such thing, and you're just like, you're looking around at hilltops and just being like, I gotta get that glider. So it's like, that's an example of dangling a carrot that keeps you going. Right. And I guess The Last of Us didn't dangle any carrot at all.
And the Zelda series in general, the whole dungeon structure. Go to a new place, find a new item, solve new puzzles, fight a new boss. Each thing's gonna be a little different twist on that. And I think a lot of games that don't, like they show their hand too early, and it's like, okay, well, I feel like I've seen everything now. Like infamous Second Son. Within the first couple hours of that game, there are other powers you can get, but it's all sort of focused on the same activities. And it's like eating, a slice of a cake, and there's no layers to it, and you're just like, oh, this is just chocolate all the way through. There's no like fudge filling in the middle, there's no icing on top, it's just like...
So the question that we're trying to triangulate here, and maybe the viewers might have some insight to drop in the comments. Like good games you go, it's a good game. I play video games for two reasons.
To feel good about myself and to think about the 1990s.
So that's, those games scratch that itch. Like Infamous has that X-Men, the cartoon vibe. But for some reason, I just don't play it. It's like I paid money for those games. What the heck? You pay full price for something and then you Just don't play it?
No.
That's
Yeah,
why?
time's money. Money's time. We're all gonna die. Maybe when it's
All gonna die.
It always boils down to, like you said, like just time for me. I'm sort of like a tapas-like player where I like to have a bunch of different plates that I'm picking from as opposed to just like one meal at a time. But sometimes it's tough to like choose which of those chunky meals I want to like really get into. You just gotta count the calories.
I like all these food metaphors.
I know. I'm hungry now.
Count the calories. I want to eat a pizza.
Let's get pizza.